Hello, and welcome to Partners Beyond Parenthood, the podcast that helps new parents thrive without losing themselves. In today's episode, we have a special guest. Her name is Sophie Villeneuve. She is a pelvic health physiotherapist and online coach specialized in prenatal and postpartum care with more than 10 years of experience. Sophie is also the creator of the Beyond Birthing Signature Program, where she helps pregnant parents from all over the world prepare their pelvic floor for a smooth birth and postpartum recovery. Lastly, she also provides free pelvic health education and tips for expecting parents on her Beyond Birthing YouTube channel. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, so my name is Sophie Villeneuve, and I'm a pelvic health physiotherapist and an online coach who helps mothers prepare their pelvic floor in the best possible way for labor and birth, so they have minimal injuries, and then I help them recover after, so they have hopefully the best pelvic floor after birth and can do whatever they want without having any pelvic floor issues like bladder leakage or prolapse or pelvic pain or the common issues that sometimes people have after the motherhood journey.
Right. And us mothers, I have to say, we are very grateful for people like you, because I, before becoming pregnant, had no idea what my pelvic floor was. I bet a lot of mothers can relate.
Yes,
So
totally.
how did you learn about the pelvic floor, and how did you actually get into this?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I first took my first pelvic floor class, a lot of the physiotherapists in the room were moms who had already had issues, whereas I was like just, I think, 28, and I had not had my kids yet. And I think it was coming from a friend of mine who was doing this work and said it's so impactful to be helping women in regards to their pelvic health, because it's often issues that they don't talk about with other people, and therefore you become that person who is this very special person that they open up about bladder incontinence or painful sex issues or prolapse, all these things that sometimes people can be embarrassed to talk about, and you are that special person helping them with that, and that makes such a huge difference in their quality of life. So she kind of sold it to me that way, and I was looking to specialize in something as a physiotherapist, and so I was like, oh, I'll just go take a course, and see how that feels. And it was instant love for me, like instant passion. And I just took more and more courses. And eventually in my practice, I discovered that most of my clientele were moms who had given birth and had issues like the issues I just described. So painful sex, incontinence, sometimes they can have bowel issues, pelvic pain. And I was like, how can I help these mothers not get to that point? How can we prevent, instead of just having them after the birth and then dealing with the consequences? So that's how I got into creating a program to help them prevent these issues from early pregnancy, and then supporting them throughout the pregnancy and then postpartum.
Wow, that's awesome. How long did it take you to essentially go into that specialization? I think I've read that you've been doing this since 2015, but how long does the actual specialization take for this?
So it's a long process, because there's not like one course that you take that will give you all of the skills. So it's really kind of building up your skill set by taking different courses.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say like every year I take something new to like help build up my skills. Over the first 5 years of my practice is when I really digged into postpartum and prenatal care. I did a really interesting course at the Institute for Birth Healing in Colorado. It's a physiotherapist called Lynn Schulte, and she has this amazing certification program to help providers who are working with moms. It can be doulas or physiotherapists or midwives. And she teaches a lot of techniques to help preparing the body for birth and then recovering after. So that was really like a key piece of my training to become more specialized.
Okay, that's awesome. And sorry, if I heard correctly, you said it was about 5 years of taking different courses to specialize. That is a really long
Yes.
time. I had no idea that so much time goes
I
into
mean,
it.
yeah, and I mean, I could have taken them more close to each other, right? And did it in one
Okay.
year. But I think the more you see people in the clinic and the more you say like, oh, I've seen this issue multiple times. How can I learn more about that? So I think for me, it was important to go back in the clinic with the new knowledge, integrate it, and then add more onto it. So I think it's a better way for me to kind of apply the new skills versus like just taking all of these courses all at once and you don't, like you kind of forget about everything.
I, for one, as a mom, when I first got pregnant and learned that I need to start working on my pelvic floor, I had no idea where it was. So, for the record, for some people who maybe are first time expecting moms or maybe even second and are still a bit confused, how would you best describe where to locate it or where it is in the body?
Yeah, so I mean, I have my pelvic model with me.
Beautiful.
I know some people will be watching on YouTube,
Yeah.
so but I will also try and describe it as best as I
Hmm.
can in words so our listeners can understand. So basically, the pelvic floor is a sling of muscles that is located around the vagina and the anus. So you can picture that these muscles start from your tailbone and go all the way up to your pubic bone just above your
Hmm.
clitoris. And so they're around the anus and the vagina and the urethra. And they have different functions. One is bladder control. So the reason why you can hold your pee when you're in a big festival and there's a big lineup to the potty is because of your pelvic floor, because you're able to engage these muscles and say, no, I'm going to hold it until I make it to the bathroom. Same thing with poo. So that helps holding your poo. And then they help with pelvic stability, so the stability of your hips, your lower back.
Hmm.
And they help also with sexual function. So when you have an orgasm, the little contractions that you're feeling are actually your pelvic floor contracting. And they also have a role in circulation, so helping the blood from your lower body to come back up to your heart.
Wow. I learned a thing or two there as well. Again, it never stops.
Uh-huh. And I mean, because we're talking about motherhood, if I can speak more about the role of the pelvic floor specifically in labor and birth and postpartum, and why we're making a big deal out of it in pregnancy to take care of your pelvic floor, it's because you can picture that if you have a vaginal birth, your baby will need to go through your pelvic floor, right?
Hmm.
Because the pelvic floor is around the vagina. I always say this is the last door that your baby will have to cross before coming into this world. I compare preparing for birth as preparing for a marathon. Would you just show up to the start line of a marathon without training?
No, don't know if I'd ever show up to a marathon, but yeah.
If you did,
Yeah,
right? Like you would
absolutely.
train before.
Absolutely.
Because what happens when we don't train? We get
Yeah.
injured. And so it's the same with the pelvic floor. Why do we expect our pelvic floor to perform as best as it can during birth, which is the like most intense event they will ever have to go through in their lives,
Right.
when we don't prepare them, right? So that's when we can expect more injuries like major tearing, prolapse, and so on. And so that's why my whole approach is like, why don't we make sure that the pelvic floor is in the best possible shape to endure the demand of delivering a human being, to reduce our risk of injuries. And when we reduce our risk of injuries, then we recover faster after, and we're not dealing with extensive pain and urine incontinence and bowel incontinence, like literally pooping your
Right.
pants after birth, because we have taken care of these muscles. We knew that they were able to do the task they were supposed to do without injuring themselves.
Right.
So that's kind of their role in terms of the birth process, is like they need to allow the baby to come through, stretch and
Hmm.
open, so they don't injure themselves and tear. And then in the postpartum process, we can anticipate that these muscles have been going through so much through the
Hmm.
birth. Even for a mom who had a C-section, if she's gone into labor for an extensive period of time, maybe has pushed for a few hours, there's still a lot of strain that went on the pelvic floor,
Right.
right? So then postpartum, making sure that we are rehabilitating these muscles in the best possible way so they can go back to these 5 functions that I named before, which is bladder control, bowel control, pelvic stability, circulation, and sexual
Right.
function.
Do you deal with a lot of expecting parents or postpartum parents?
Yeah, so expecting parents is mostly what I focus on because, like I said, my goal and my mission that I've given to myself is to prevent pelvic floor
Right.
injuries and like make sure that moms have a good quality of life after birth and they're not dragging pelvic floor issues for years after their birth that could have been
Hmm.
prevented. So when I start working with people, they're normally in the beginning of their second
Hmm.
trimester and want to get started early on what can I do to train my pelvic floor in the best possible way to avoid injuries.
Okay.
However, I have been working in my practice with postpartum moms as well who unfortunately had not heard about that preventative work. And, there's still so much that we can do. I don't want to say, like, if you haven't done the prevention work, that there's nothing to
Hmm.
do. Definitely, there still consult with a pelvic floor physio if you have issues, because there's so much we can do, even 10 years postpartum, right? Like, I've had
Wow.
women in my office who like their kids were in university when they first were made aware of pelvic floor physio. And these moms were putting pads when going for a run because they were peeing their pants, had maybe some extensive pelvic pain issue during sex, that kind of stuff, following their birth for all of these years, like 18 years of dealing with this until someone said, hey, have you thought of pelvic floor physio?
Wow.
And we were still able to help these women to retrieve the quality of life.
Wow. But I mean, it's amazing that people go back after so many years and actually get, enlightened about what it could be. But that's crazy that women or, parents have lived with such issues for so long. You mentioned earlier that obviously you're working on a preventative method, which is great because naturally that may mean that they have less work postpartum or that it's a little bit of an easier transition. And you also said, I think they start around early in the second trimester is probably a good time. Is it possible to start earlier? Is it recommended? Or how early would you recommend for parents to start on this?
Absolutely. I think it can start as early as when you're trying to conceive or even before trying to conceive, right? To just consult with a pelvic floor physio and just get a picture of what these muscles look like currently. Um, because there's a lot of work. Like, if, say, we identify that your pelvic floor is very weak, then why not strengthening right away before you get pregnant and you have that extra load on your pelvic floor? Because that's another impact of the motherhood journey on the pelvic floor. I've talked about the impact of birth, but I haven't talked about the pregnancy itself, right? We have a human being growing on top of our pelvic
Yeah.
floor and like just keeps adding weight. So some people say if they had a weak pelvic floor prior to their pregnancy and then suddenly they get pregnant, they may start having symptoms of urine incontinence through pregnancy because the pelvic floor is just not able to sustain that
Right.
load. So by having that consultation earlier than pregnancy, we are able to be like, okay, your pelvic floor will be in the best possible shape for when you get pregnant. So I think there's no like, I think people can consult at any
Right.
time, really. But I think the second trimester is a great sweet spot for maybe someone who were not aware of that. And then through pregnancy, I think a lot of providers bring the importance of pelvic health. Like, if you go see your midwife or your doctor, they might be like, hey, have you considered, working with a pelvic floor physio? And so that's why I think people are more aware that that's when they should get
Right.
started, but they can definitely get started
Okay.
earlier.
Yeah, I, for one, I have to say, I gave birth in Mexico, and I'm really grateful for the gynecologist that I had, or the obstetrician, because she did CrossFit. I did CrossFit during my pregnancy, and she's the one who said, "Okay, you also want to take care of your pelvic floor." And I was like, "My what?" um, so I am really grateful. Like, I think also having a gyno that can recommend you, or maybe who does sports themselves and realize the importance of that, who's guided a few, that was definitely helpful for me. Um, but one thing I wanted to ask there as well, is there a difference between first time and second time expecting parents with regards to how to prepare your pelvic floor?
It depends. If a second time mom had not consulted a pelvic floor physio after her first birth, then there could be a difference there because she might still have some things to work on to kind of um, I don't want to say fix, but address issues that might have been caused by her first pregnancy and her first birth, and that went unaddressed, and then suddenly get pregnant for a second time. And now we have to not only prepare her for that second
Right.
birth, but we also have to deal with all the issues that have been maybe piled up from her first
Right.
pregnancy and birth. So in that case, I would say, yes, it's different. But if someone had done like everything they could and had consulted with a physio after their first birth, everything was good, they recovered 100%, then in that case, it would not be different, because we would just approach it as training for a marathon.
Right.
So like making sure the muscles can be flexible, stretchy, have a good strength to recover after.
Okay. And in what condition, an ideal condition, would your pelvic floor be to have a vaginal birth?
Good question. So I need to bring up the issue of pelvic floor tightness here. So like any muscle in our body, the pelvic floor can be tight. Like your shoulder muscles can be tight, your jaw muscles can be tight. The pelvic floor can also be tight. And that can become an issue when we want to give birth vaginally. First, it can actually lead to a C-section if someone's pelvic floor was so tight that it would not allow the baby to come through at all. I've seen some cases of mamas who had a C-section because of that. It doesn't mean that this is where the baby will get stuck. Like sometimes they get stuck more kind of at the pelvic bone level. Like if the pelvis is actually too narrow, the baby might not be able to actually descend and get to the pelvic floor itself.
Okay.
So that's another issue. So yeah, pelvic floor tightness is a thing. And I think a lot of people don't know that they have a tight pelvic floor before they get assessed by a pelvic floor physio, or just kind of have awareness about what are the signs of a tight pelvic floor. So maybe I can touch on that a little bit. So basically, painful sex is a big one. So if someone felt like there's not enough space when there's penetration, or they always need to kind of warm up for sex to be comfortable, that's a huge sign of pelvic floor tightness. If someone had problem with tampon insertion, from the young age, sometimes there's women I see, they said like, I've never been able to insert a tampon. Right? Like, so that's another sign. Someone who'd say, every time I go see the doctor or the gynae, they need the smallest speculum to insert in my vagina because it's too tight. So those are very, very, like I'd say, red flag signs of pelvic floor tightness. And there's other ones that are kind of yellow flags for me. Someone who would go to the bathroom very often. So I mean by that, less than every 2 hours prior to pregnancy, like someone who just goes and goes and goes. That's a sign of pelvic floor tightness. Pain around the vulva area, the coccyx area or tailbone are also signs. And then people who are very, very active. So I'm thinking of the runners, like people who run a lot, people who do horseback riding, dancing as well, like ballet is a big one, because I think these people tend to contract a lot this area and they don't spend a lot of time releasing. And so that can lead to a tight pelvic floor. And so when we do have a tight pelvic floor, then it can impact our ability to give birth vaginally, or the baby might still come through, but there might be a lot of tearing associated with the birth.
Well, thanks for explaining that. I definitely, again, learned a lot. But one thing I'm actually also curious about, you mentioned sometimes they may not even be able to descend to the pelvic floor. Does that mean that the anatomy can actually have an impact on this? And I asked this from more of a personal experience as well. Interestingly, my mom had 2 C-sections. I had to have a C-section as well. And I mean, I had a doula, I tried to do as much preparation as I could. But eventually they just said, not coming through. I was 6 centimeters dilated, nothing. Had the epidural, that stopped all contractions. She just wasn't descending further. And then I told the doctor, I was like, well, could it be my anatomy? Like my mom had a C-section as well. And he was like, why didn't you tell me? Of course. And I was like, wait, what? Because my doula had said something entirely different. Like, no, you should be able to, etc. So I'm actually curious to hear your advice there, what
Yeah,
you'd think there.
I just want to say like it's so normal to wonder what the cause
Hmm.
is, right? I think like we're so hammered that like the body is meant to be giving birth,
Hmm.
and so there can be feelings of like feeling almost defeated, like my body should be able to do
Yeah.
that, and like trying to find
Yeah.
reasons. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And so yes, the pelvic anatomy can definitely impact the ability for the baby to descend into the
Hmm.
pelvis. So for example, some people might have too narrow here of a space here. Like I'm just, for those who are just listening and don't
Yeah.
see the visual, there's basically the pelvis, and what we call the pelvic inlet is that hole where the baby needs to come down before they get to the pelvic
Hmm.
floor. And so if that space is too constricted, yes, it can restrict. What we're hoping for and what should happen is that the body releases a lot of hormones during labor to try and the ligaments to stretch, right? So that even if you have a narrow pelvis, like these bones should be able to stretch. But sometimes it just doesn't happen for some people. So yes, that can be a factor. The cervix is another one, another big one, right? Like sometimes it's just that the cervix for some reason doesn't dilate, and then it's not because the bones are not opening, but actually because the cervix doesn't allow
Right.
the baby to come down.
Okay.
So
So there's a few things.
it's always hard to know, right? Like what the exact reason
Yeah.
is. In our program, we teach parents some techniques to help the bones to open up during that process, because there are some manual pressure points that the birth partner can do to help the bones to
Hmm.
open. But sometimes, in like, even if you've tried everything, sometimes it just doesn't work,
Right.
right? And it doesn't mean that you have, you know, that you haven't done what you had to do.
No, and I think it's really important that you said that as well, because it is true. I think for quite a few weeks after the birth, I also thought, why wasn't my body able to deliver vaginally? I'd prepared, I'd taken courses, etc. I definitely felt a little defeated, but it's good to hear
Mhm.
that there can be other things.
Especially after having gone through labor,
Yeah,
right? Like, I think it's different if you are scheduled for a C-section and you're like, I'm not giving it a shot. But like, if you're in pain for hours, and I don't know how long your labor
yeah,
was, but like, it can feel like I've done all this work, I've gone through all this
yeah,
pain, and to then end up with something that I could have scheduled,
yeah, yeah.
So I can understand that. And I just want to say, I always encourage my patients to go consult with a mental health therapist after the birth if they feel like there's any feelings like that of like, I don't feel quite good about what my birth looked like, because I feel like we hold trauma in our
Hmm.
body, and sometimes it's so healing to release that and to be able to move on, especially if you want another kid
Yeah,
later, like just to like, yeah, just clear that out of your body, and then approach a new pregnancy and a new birth with a different mindset.
yeah,
And I would say, like, personally, when I gave birth to my son, I had a little bit of a similar experience. It didn't end up in a C-section, but like, I had gone into labor on my own naturally, which I was really proud of. And then my labor stalled, and they were like, "Oh, we need to induce you." And for me, induction was just like, "Oh no, here we go. Now I'm going to need an
right.
epidural and a cascade of
Hmm.
interventions." And eventually they brought up the C-section. They were like, "Okay, Sophie, if you don't push that baby out within the next 45, like,
Hmm.
we're going to have to go to C-section." And I had been in labor for 52 2 hours or something
Oh
like
my
that.
gosh.
And like that feeling of like, okay, I'm trapped now. And I would have felt so defeated to go into C-section after all of this work. So
Wow.
yeah, I can totally appreciate that. Yeah, like how you might have felt after.
I mean, 52 hours of labor is, I don't think I've heard of that yet. That's, I have to say, chapeau. Wow.
It was not intense the whole
It
time,
doesn't matter. Labor
but yeah,
starts and
there
your
was definitely
body,
not a lot of sleep involved.
yeah. I mean, also your body kind of hits some kind of like something's happening in your brain, right? Like even if started and you're not necessarily feeling the strong labor, like the active labor, it's still quite something. I mean, I was not in
Yeah.
labor for that long. I think mine lasted 15 hours before they were like, okay, we need to take you to do a C-section because nothing else was working. But my active labor also started half an hour after my water broke. So it was very quick.
Okay. Wow.
But yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think birth stories are always very interesting to hear just how different they can be, right? So let's say for myself, again, it's a personal question, and I'm sure many other people will have endured this as well, may not even know about it. Um, how can pelvic floor training support expecting parents who may want to have a VBAC? So a VBAC being a vaginal birth after a C-section.
Hmm. I'm glad you're asking that because we've got so many beautiful stories from clients in our program who have achieved their goal of having a VBAC a second time around. And I don't want to take all the credit saying like this is just the pelvic floor. I think there's also something to be said about a second time birth can be different in how it presents too, because your body has already kind of gone through part of labor before. But anyways, what we can do differently is like if say, well, you could consult right now with someone to just see the state of your pelvic floor and see could that have been a factor almost.
Mm-hmm.
In your case, I'm thinking it's not that because you were at 6 centimeters and you were not even pushing yet when that
Mm-hmm.
happened. If someone had been pushing and the baby was not coming through, that is more likely kind of ringing for me like pelvic floor
Mm-hmm.
tightness. But anyways, I would say like how we would approach this is let's meet up in early pregnancy, like say beginning of second trimester. Look at your pelvic floor. Is it tight? Is it not? A lot of the times for these moms who had C-sections, I found tight pelvic floor
Mm-hmm.
issues. So we were able to stretch it right from the second trimester, not like 3 weeks before birth when it's too late to like get actual
Okay.
results, and make sure that we prepare the pelvic floor so it's able to stretch and release when the time
Mm-hmm.
comes. I do also talk about trauma release, so like making sure that we are consulting with a counselor or something to make sure that we are clearing whatever maybe we are holding in our pelvis from that first birth experience, to make sure that we are approaching that with the right
Mm-hmm.
mindset or like a fresh mindset. And then yeah, any technique to help the pelvis to open during the labor process, which is something you can learn with your birth partner during your pregnancy to make sure that you both are confident in applying these techniques during labor.
Okay.
um, and I would say like just the mental piece of, you know, when we do the perineal stretch, that's a stretch that we do for the pelvic floor a few weeks prior to birth. And what I like about that is the mom can actually look at the stretch with a mirror while her partner is doing
Mm-hmm.
it and see, oh my God, like I'm already like, I don't know, at 5 or 6 centimeters at my vaginal opening. And I think that is just like, oh my God, I think I can do this,
Mm-hmm.
right? But like, when in life do you actually stretch your vagina to see how far it can stretch?
Or and look at it while
Like,
doing
if
it,
you,
right?
exactly, right? So I do it sometimes with the patients who come in my clinic. I'm like, okay, you're 34 weeks. Do you want me to do the stretch for you and see how far we can get? And every time they're blown away. They're like, wow, I didn't know that I could stretch that much. And I say, yeah, you can. And that peace of mind of like, okay, you know, I'm already able to stretch that much with very little
Mm-hmm.
discomfort. I think I can birth a
Right.
baby, right? And going into the birth room with that mindset of I can do
Yeah.
it, and not like being scared of pushing your baby out or scared of
Yeah.
tearing, can make a huge difference in how you present.
Absolutely. I definitely think knowing something like that can help you have a positive mindset going into labor, just to see what your body is really capable of, right? And for those, let's say, athletes, how does that impact it? Because I believe, at least from what I know, but please correct me if I'm wrong, um, your pelvic floor may naturally be a little tighter because of a lot of exercise that you have been doing. Is that heavily impacted through sports, or can it be resolved a lot with stretching if you continue sports throughout pregnancy?
Absolutely. So, like, regardless who it is who shows up in my office, like athlete or not, we're going to still do the same assessment. And if we find tightness, it's going to be the same
Okay.
approach of resolving tightness. If you continue doing the activities that bring tightness, I think we will be a bit more diligent in including some pelvic floor stretching after your activities to make sure that we're not like working against each
Right.
other here, like doing the stretching in the bedroom and then like going for a long run and then creating tightness
Right.
again. So we might be a bit more proactive in including some general stretching for the pelvic floor after the activities.
Okay. I just want to clarify for myself and maybe those listening. Those who have a weak pelvic floor, do you encourage a lot more strengthening exercises, or what kind of exercises or sports would you recommend for those kind of patients?
Yes, definitely. So if someone had a very weak pelvic floor, and I will say this is the minority, like I mean, I've been doing this work for almost 10 years now, and I feel like the tight pelvic floor issue is something that comes up way more than a weak pelvic floor. It's either people have a healthy pelvic floor that is like has a normal strength, or they are tight, and like there's a very minimal amount of people who actually have true pelvic floor weakness. And so for those people, we would probably go with like a more focused pelvic floor program where we're doing Kegel
Okay.
exercises a few times a day to strengthen their pelvic floor. If they were doing any heavy lifting through CrossFit or that kind of stuff, I might ask them to include a pelvic floor contraction with the lifting motion. But this is really just more advanced exercises once they have mastered the pelvic floor contraction on their
Right.
own. Because for someone who is weak, it's very easy to go into compensating and using your glutes
Mm.
or your inner thigh muscles, because those muscles are so strong and they just want to kick in right away when you're trying to do your pelvic floor exercises, because it's way easier to connect with
Right.
those. So we want to like first build up a connection with the pelvic floor, make sure that, okay, are you able to actually engage these muscles on your own? Once you have mastered that, can we hold the contraction for up to 10 seconds, right? And squeeze the pelvic floor. And then are we able to repeat that over a few
Okay.
reps? And then once that is mastered, we can include that into different activities.
You look at it, so many different aspects. I absolutely love that. How early can you start on your healing journey postpartum, and what would that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically, people have been consulting, the earliest would be 6 weeks postpartum. And the reason for that is that at 6 weeks, normally, if you've had any tearing, any stitches, at 6 weeks, normally that should be healed. And so an internal pelvic floor assessment could be done at that point. So when we assess the pelvic floor, we want to go internally in the vagina because the muscles are inside the vagina, and that gives us so much more information to go internally versus just assessing them
Mm-hmm.
externally. So because that involves that internal assessment, we want to make sure that any wounds or like tears are fully healed. For a C-section, same thing. You have an incision, and so we want to make sure that the incision is healed before we start any massaging of the incision and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. However, I think if someone had like major symptoms, like say you can't hold your bladder at all, right? You have like pain that restricts you from sitting and feeding your baby. Those kind of like symptoms that have an impact on your function and your ability to take care of your newborn, then I would say you consult way earlier, because there are a lot of things that we can do before the 6 weeks
Right.
mark that doesn't involve internal assessment or massaging the scar,
Right.
that can help
Mhm.
women. But if someone was working just with an in-person physio, I would say, you know, maybe like even scheduling an assessment 3 to 4 weeks after
Mhm.
your birth or your C-section to check in, even if it's like a phone check-in, right? Saying like, hey, this is what's going on, and then they can tell you, okay, like here are some advice to manage your
Mhm.
symptoms. and just to have like a contact point, because so many moms are left to themselves postpartum.
Yep.
I don't know for you, but in Canada, the first check-in we have with our doctor is 6 weeks
Mm-hmm.
postpartum, and it's the most symptomatic phase of postpartum, right? Where you might have hemorrhoids, pooping can be hard, you might have incontinence, things are hurting, things are swollen. For C-sections, it's hard to get in and out of bed,
Mm-hmm.
like getting up the stairs. You're wondering, can I go for a walk with my baby if I still have pain? Do I need to take medication? Like,
Right.
there's so many questions, and a physio can just kind of bring reassurance in, like, okay, this is where you're at right now, here are the priorities. And that postpartum brain loves that. These are my three priorities, because when you're sleep
Mm-hmm.
deprived, it can be hard to like know exactly what to do.
Yeah.
If someone is doing relatively well, and like, things are going, there's not a lot of symptoms, then I would say 6 weeks is a great point to get started.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. You mentioned that you can see someone earlier, because I think when I was looking at rehab courses, a lot of what I'd seen there was that you can actually start with breathing exercises, for example, as early as three
Yes.
weeks, which doesn't necessarily involve like actually, working out or anything, but literally just using your breath to help strengthen your pelvic floor. And later, when I moved to Barcelona, I found a Pilates instructor who focuses a lot on hypopressives, I think is what they're called in English.
Mhm.
I had never heard of that before, so I thought that was really interesting. One last question I have, which may be a bit of a side note. Um, I've always been interested because my husband never really thinks about it, but pelvic floor health is also very important for men, correct? Okay.
Yes, 100%. Men do have pelvic floors as well. And I think the reason why maybe they don't have as many issues as women in that regard is because their anatomy is just different, right? They don't have the vaginal canal in the
Okay.
middle where things can fall down
Yeah.
into. So that, and their pelvis is a bit more narrow as well,
Okay.
so that provides more
Okay.
stability. But definitely, like, some men have pain with ejaculation, for example, that can be linked to pelvic floor issues. They can have urinary urgency or frequency, so going to the bathroom very
Mhm.
often, or feeling that sensation that they need to go like very urgently. Constipation is another one, like not being able to release the anal
Okay.
sphincter, and then hemorrhoids. So yeah, there's a variety of symptoms that can also be experienced by men, and there's pelvic floor physiotherapists who see men as
Okay.
well, so they can definitely seek out some
Do you
help.
see men as well, or do you focus on mothers or women primarily?
I unfortunately had to narrow down a little bit because I was in demand a lot, and I had to focus on my
Of
specialty.
course.
But there's other physios in my community who do provide care for men.
You have shared so much value. Thank you so, so much, Sophie. If one of our listeners is expecting right now and wondering how to get started with their pelvic floor preparation for their birth, what resources do you have to share?
Well, the first one is my YouTube channel. So it's called Beyond Birthing, and you'll get a lot of free tips on there, and just kind of get an idea of what the pelvic floor is, and kind of dip your toes in the water. And then I have also a free online masterclass for people who want to dive deeper. So you can join at
Uh-huh.
www.beyond-birthing.ca/masterclass. And in that masterclass, it's about 45
Mhm.
minutes, and I dive deeper into how to prepare the pelvic floor for an injury free birth, and then a smooth postpartum recovery.
Okay, that's awesome. I, for one, have checked out your YouTube channel. There is so much value. So, for those listening, if you want to deep dive into certain topics, I can recommend it. I've learned a lot. I've learned even more on this talk with you. So, thank you so much. Really grateful
Thank
for
you.
people like you out there sharing more. And you also have a course, I believe, right? It's online. So, it's in English, but that can be accessed by anyone, correct?
Totally. So it's an online coaching program. It starts in the second trimester. And the way to get started with that is really to start by scheduling a free discovery session together. So we'll actually have a face-to-face conversation to discuss your situation, your goals, and your needs. And then from there, we will see, like, are we a fit to work together? And then we can get started from there. So in order to book a free discovery session with me, it's beyond-birthing.com/apply, and we can put that in the show notes as
Awesome.
well.
I'll definitely do that. So
Okay.
since it is international, how do you do some of the assessments of pelvic tightness, for example?
So I provide the members of our program with a lot of self-assessment tools, so they can kind of do it on themselves. And then I say, if you have found these things, ideally you would be consulting with a pelvic floor physio to validate your findings. If someone was in an area where they had no access to a pelvic floor physio, then we provide customized coaching in our program. So that means I work with people like to help them figure out their issues more specifically. So then they can come and ask me on the live coaching calls. We also have a Facebook community where they have access to me, and then we can have those back and forth conversations so I can assess them or like address their issues more specifically. Of course, it's always nice when people can have an in-person provider to kind of fine-tune things, but we can definitely help people a lot just with that back and forth communication.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that. That is something that definitely popped up that I was like, let's say if I was interested in doing this, right, when I'm perhaps expecting the next time, and I wanted to join this course, how would I do it since, I'm quite far away, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think I have so much information here that I have been able, or that I will be sharing with the listeners. Thank you so much, Sophie, for sharing it today, for being here. And do you have any other questions for me?
No, actually, I'm just very grateful that we met today, and it was just so interesting to hear about your experience as well and the questions that you had following your birth, because this is all great information for me to create more YouTube videos. So every time I hear like questions from moms, I always take note, and I'm like, oh, I can create a video maybe about that topic.
Great.
So thanks for being vulnerable with me and sharing your story. And it was really great to be on your podcast.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Thank you so much for tuning in and sticking around to the end. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you've just watched and enjoyed this video, I'd be so grateful for a like and if you'd hit the subscribe button. With your support, I'll be able to invite bigger guests and provide more value. If you're listening to the audio only, make sure to follow this podcast to get tips on parenting and partnership and hear inspiring stories from other parents as well. See you next week.